9 prisoners, 9 brutal crimes, and 9 final walks to the death chamber. In 2025, Florida carried out more executions than in any year in recent history, each one tied to a story of shocking violence, broken families, and haunting last words. From serial killers who left trails of bodies across the state, to fathers who turned their homes into scenes of horror, these cases reveal the darkest side of human nature and the chilling reality of capital punishment in the Sunshine State. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel, stay updated on all things true crime, and join our growing community. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. James Dennis Ford. It was the summer of 1997 when James Dennis Ford crossed a line so violent, so unthinkable, that it would seal his fate forever. Ford was no stranger to trouble. Born in 1962, he grew up in Florida, drifting in and out of stability, and by his mid-30s, his life had already been marked by reckless decisions and brushes with the law. But nothing in his past compared to what he would do to a young couple who had trusted him enough to share a fishing trip. On June 18, 1997, Gregory and Kimberly Malnory invited Ford on a day of fishing. With them was their 22-month-old daughter, too young to understand danger, too innocent to imagine what was about to unfold. Somewhere during that outing, Ford's demeanor shifted. Whether it was planned or a sudden eruption of violence, what happened next was a scene of unimaginable brutality. Ford turned on Gregory first. He shot him, then beat him savagely before slitting his throat. The violence was overkill, an eruption of rage and control that stripped Gregory of any chance of survival. And all of this happened with his toddler daughter looking on. But Ford wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Kimberly. What followed was a crime of both sexual violence and murder. He raped her, then shot her, ending her life in the same horrific fashion as her husband's. When it was over, 2 lives had been brutally taken, and a child had been left with the lifelong trauma of witnessing her parents' murders. It didn't take long for investigators to connect Ford to the killings. The brutality of the crime, combined with the fact that he had been the last person seen with the Malnorys, made him the prime suspect. During the trial, the evidence against him stacked high. Forensic details, witness accounts, and the sheer savagery of the crime painted Ford as a man who acted without conscience. Prosecutors described his actions as not only calculated but monstrous, pointing to the fact that he executed Gregory in front of his child and then turned Kimberly's final moments into an act of unspeakable cruelty. The jury did not deliberate for long. The sentence: death. James Dennis Ford spent over 2 decades on Florida's death row. For years, appeals wound their way through the courts, but none were enough to save him. The Malnory family, forever broken by the murders, watched the process drag on, waiting for a final resolution. Reports from prison described Ford as quiet and withdrawn. Unlike some inmates who became notorious for public statements or erratic behavior, Ford faded into the background, a man marked only by the shadow of the crime he could never undo. On February 13, 2025, at Florida State Prison, James Dennis Ford's sentence was carried out by lethal injection. His last meal? Nothing out of the ordinary. He accepted the standard prison fare rather than requesting anything special. Some say this choice reflected indifference. Others saw it as a final rejection of ritual. When asked for last words, Ford declined. He had nothing to say, not to the state, not to the victims' families, not even to the witnesses gathered behind the glass. His silence spoke volumes. At 6:08 p.m., James Dennis Ford was pronounced dead. For the surviving members of the Malnory family, particularly the child who had once been too young to comprehend the violence around her, Ford's execution closed a chapter, but it did not erase the scars. The case remains one of the most haunting examples of Florida's death penalty history, not just for the brutality of the crime, but for the image that still lingers. A toddler trapped in the middle of her parents' final moments, left with silence and memory as her only inheritance. Edward Thomas James. Eddie was born in Florida in the late 1960s, growing up in a world that was already weighted against him. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was caught in the cycle of drugs, crime, and poverty that so often breeds desperation. Neighbors later recalled him as someone who could be quiet and unassuming one moment, then volatile the next. He was a man who lived on the margins, drifting in and out of trouble, never quite finding stability. By 1993, Eddie was 29 years old. He had already tangled with the law for theft and burglary, but nothing prepared anyone for what he would do on a summer afternoon in Castleberry, Florida, a quiet suburb outside Orlando. It was June 27, 1993. Inside a modest home, an ordinary family day took a tragic turn. 8-year-old Toni Van Dam, a bright, innocent child with her whole life ahead of her, was staying with her grandmother, 68-year-old Fanny Brown, a woman known for her warmth and devotion to her family. Eddie James entered their home with the intent to rob. But what happened next escalated into unspeakable violence. The details remain haunting. Fanny Brown was attacked first. Eddie beat and stabbed her, ensuring she would not be able to call for help. Then he turned on young Toni. The brutality of his actions against an innocent child horrified even seasoned detectives. It was a crime so savage, so senseless, that investigators later admitted it was one of the darkest cases of their careers. When the bodies were discovered, Castleberry changed forever. The tight-knit community was thrust into fear. Parents held their children tighter. Elderly neighbors double-locked their doors. The Van Dam family was devastated, their lives upended by a man they didn't even know. Law enforcement quickly identified Eddie James as the suspect, but catching him would not be easy. James fled the scene and went into hiding. For weeks, he slipped through cracks, moving from place to place, leaving police one step behind. His escape and the brutality of his crimes caught national attention. Soon, his face was broadcast across the country on America's Most Wanted, turning him from a Florida fugitive into a household name in the ongoing debate about violent crime in the 1990s. The public responded. Tips flooded in. And finally, Eddie James was captured. When Eddie James finally stood before a Florida jury, the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors painted a picture of a violent man who had crossed every line. The jury listened to graphic details of the crime, the terror of the victims, the brutality of the murders, and deliberated his fate. James was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the state sought the ultimate penalty. In 1994, he was sentenced to death. For the families of Toni and Fanny, the sentence offered a measure of justice, though nothing could erase their pain. At Florida State Prison, Eddie James entered the long liminal existence that so many death row inmates endure. For nearly 2 decades, he lived in a 6-by-9-foot cell, with little more than a metal bed, a toilet, and the weight of what he had done. Inmates around him spoke of the silence, the endless waiting, the countdowns that never seemed to move. Eddie became just another name in the grim roster of men awaiting execution in Florida, though his crime remained one of the most notorious. By the time his execution date neared, Eddie James was no longer the young man who had committed those horrific murders. He was in his late 40s, worn by prison life. On March 23, 2012, Eddie James was executed by lethal injection in Florida. At 4:17 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Michael Anthony Tanzi. Michael Anthony Tanzi's crime wasn't just horrifying, it was a painful saga that spanned decades. In April 2000, Tanzi confronted Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old Miami Herald production worker, as she sat in her van on a lunch break. He assaulted her with a razor blade, forced her into the vehicle, bound and gagged her, robbed her, and drove her to the Florida Keys. There on Cudjoe Key, he strangled her to death and left her body hidden in a wooded area. Authorities later said he confessed and personally led investigators to where her body was buried. Convicted and sentenced in 2003, Tanzi received Florida's harshest penalty after a jury unanimously recommended death. In his final appeals, Tanzi's lawyers argued that his obesity and health conditions could make lethal injection a cruel and unusual punishment, potentially leading to a botched execution. The courts rejected those arguments, and even the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. On April 8, 2025, Tanzi was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison and pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. His last meal included a pork chop, bacon, a baked potato, corn, soda, ice cream, and a candy bar. Before the drugs took effect, he spoke softly. "I want to apologize to the family. and then recited a Bible verse. Witnesses reported that his chest heaved for several minutes before he was declared dead. His passing was heavy with emotion, especially for the victim's family, who had waited nearly 25 years for justice. As Janet Acosta's sister said afterward, "It's done. Basically, justice for Janet happened. My heart felt lighter, and I can breathe again." Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson, a Gulf War veteran and former Army Ranger, committed one of the most chilling domestic massacres Florida has ever seen. On September 11, 1998, in Crestview, Florida, after an argument with his girlfriend, 32-year-old Renee Flaherty, Hutchinson left the house, went drinking, and later returned armed with a 12-gauge shotgun. In a rampage that stunned investigators, he killed Renee and her 3 children, Jeffrey, just 9 years old, Amanda, 7, and Logan, only 4. Each child was shot in the head, and Jeffrey suffered an additional wound to the chest. After the killings, Hutchinson dialed 911 and chillingly told the operator, "I just shot my family." Police found him in the garage with gunshot residue on his hands. At trial, Hutchinson attempted to blame masked intruders and claimed he had been intoxicated, but the jury rejected his defense. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison for Renee's death, plus 3 separate death sentences for the children. Over the years, Hutchinson's lawyers tried to appeal, pointing to his Gulf War service, PTSD, and possible brain damage. Still, Florida's courts consistently ruled against him, finding him competent and responsible for the killings. His execution was set after Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. On May 1st, 2025, at Florida State Prison, Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection at 8:15 p.m. Witnesses reported that his body twitched slightly before falling still. He offered no last words, leaving the chamber in silence. For the victim's family, the moment was bittersweet. Renee's brother stated afterward that justice had been done, but that no execution could erase the grief of losing his sister and her children in such a brutal way. Glenn Edward Rogers. Glenn Edward Rogers earned his notorious nickname, the Casanova Killer, by charming women, only to lure them into deadly encounters. His most infamous crime in Florida occurred in late 1995 in Tampa. After meeting 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs at a bar, he persuaded her to give him a ride. 2 days later, Cribbs was found stabbed to death in a motel bathtub, the scene chillingly reminiscent of several others tied to Rogers. Convicted for this murder in 1997, Rogers also received a death sentence in California in 1999 for another killing, and investigators linked him to anywhere from dozens to 70 other murders across the U.S. After nearly 3 decades behind bars, Glenn Edward Rogers was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on May 15, 2025 at 6:16 p.m. For his last meal, Rogers chose pizza, chocolate cake, and soda. In his final statement, he addressed the families of victims with unsettling ambiguity, saying, "I know there's a lot of questions you need answers to. I promise you in the near future the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure." Then, turning his attention unexpectedly to politics, he added, "President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." When the lethal injection began, Rogers lay nearly motionless throughout the 16-minute procedure. At one point, a corrections officer gently shook his shoulders, calling his name to check for consciousness, but there was no response. The execution closed the chapter on one of America's most unsettling suspected serial killers, but Rogers' cryptic words and the trail of violence linked to his name continue to leave haunting questions. Anthony Wainwright. Anthony Brian Wainwright's case is remembered as one of Florida's most brutal crimes of the 1990s. In 1994, the 23-year-old ex-convict was living a transient lifestyle when he crossed paths with Carmen Gayhart, a 23-year-old young mother of 2 in Columbia County, Florida. What began as a chance encounter turned into a nightmare. Wainwright abducted Carmen at gunpoint, forcing her into her car. Over the course of the day, he drove her across state lines into South Carolina, where he repeatedly raped her. Eventually, he strangled Carmen to death with a piece of stereo wire. Her body was later discovered abandoned in a wooded area near a rural road, a shocking and tragic end for a woman described by her family as kind, warm, and devoted to her children. Law enforcement tracked Wainwright quickly after he attempted to pawn some of Carmen's belongings. He was arrested in South Carolina and extradited back to Florida, where he was charged and convicted of murder, sexual battery, kidnapping, and armed robbery. In 1995, a jury sentenced him to death, a sentence that would take nearly 3 decades to carry out. On May 29, 2025, after years of appeals and denials for clemency, Anthony Wainwright was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His last meal was simple and classic: a cheeseburger, French fries, and a soda. In his final words, Wainwright expressed remorse. Facing the families of both his victim and his own loved ones, he said he was sorry for what he had done and wished he could take it all back. His apology, though heavy with regret, came decades too late for the life he had stolen. For Carmen Gayhart's family, the execution was a painful reminder of what had been lost, a young mother who never got the chance to watch her children grow up. Wainwright's death closed the case legally, but the grief left behind remains immeasurable. Thomas Lee Gudinas. Thomas Lee Gudinas' crime in 1994 was so brutal that it sent shockwaves across Florida. His victim was 23-year-old Michelle McGrath, a college student who had been out with friends in Orlando on the night of her murder. After leaving a local bar, Michelle was last seen walking toward her car in a downtown parking lot. That's when she crossed paths with Gudinas. Gudinas attacked her violently, dragging her into a nearby alley. Witnesses later testified that they heard her screams, but by the time police arrived, it was too late. Michelle had been beaten, raped, and strangled. The sheer violence of the assault drew widespread media coverage, not only because of the brutality, but also because Michelle was a young woman with her entire life ahead of her. Investigators quickly identified Gudinas as the prime suspect. He had a history of criminal behavior and was known to frequent the area where Michelle had been killed. DNA evidence sealed the case against him, linking him directly to the assault and murder. In 1996, a Florida jury convicted him of first-degree murder and sexual battery, and he was sentenced to death. After decades of appeals, Thomas Lee Gudinas faced his execution on June 25, 2025, at Florida State Prison. Unlike many others on death row, he declined to request a special last meal and accepted the standard prison fare offered that evening. When asked if he wanted to make a final statement, Gudinas chose silence. He offered no apology, no explanation, and no acknowledgement of his crimes. Witnesses described his final moments as quiet and emotionless, a stark contrast to the violence that had defined the crime for which he was condemned. For Michelle McGrath's family, the execution brought a measure of closure, but the pain of losing her in such a brutal way remains a lasting scar. Gudinas' silence and death left behind only unanswered questions and a chilling reminder of the cruelty of his actions. Michael Bernard Bell. Michael Bernard Bell's crimes haunted Florida in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Investigators believe he was responsible for at least 5 murders between 1989 and 1993, marking him as one of the state's more prolific killers of the era. The murders that ultimately sealed his fate were the double killings of Jimmy West and Tameka Smith. Both victims were found brutally slain in what prosecutors described as part of Bell's calculated spree of violence. Detectives linked him to the crimes through physical evidence, witness testimony, and a trail of brutality that matched his previous patterns. Bell's name was whispered among law enforcement as a likely serial killer. While officially tied to several killings, investigators suspected his body count could be even higher. The sheer callousness of his crimes, targeting men and women alike, made him one of the most feared figures in Florida's criminal history during that time. After his conviction, Bell spent more than 3 decades on death row, his appeals dragging on while families of the victims waited for closure. Finally, in 2025, his time ran out. On July 17, 2025, Michael Bernard Bell was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His final hours carried no drama. He did not request a special last meal, instead receiving the standard prison tray given to all inmates. When asked for a final statement, Bell refused to speak. He faced his death in silence, offering neither apology nor explanation. For the families of his victims, Bell's silence in his final moments was deeply unsettling. After years of unanswered questions, his refusal to speak left them without the closure they had hoped for. His legacy is one of terror and cruelty, a string of violent crimes that ended only with his execution. Edward J. Zakrzewski II. Few crimes in Florida's history are as disturbing as that of Edward J. Zakrzewski II. On June 9, 1994, in Pensacola, the Air Force sergeant committed a crime that shocked the nation. After learning his wife Sylvia planned to leave him and take their children, Zakrzewski carried out one of the most brutal family murders the state had ever seen. Armed with a machete and a knife, he first attacked Sylvia, striking her repeatedly before stabbing her to death. He then turned on his children, Edward, just 7 years old, and Anna, only 5. Both were killed in the same vicious manner, their young lives cut short in an act of rage and despair. Afterward, Zakrzewski fled Florida and went into hiding in Hawaii. Months later, he was captured and extradited back to face justice. The sheer savagery of the killings stunned investigators. Prosecutors argued that Zakrzewski had plotted the murders in advance and carried them out in cold blood, while the defense tried to present him as a man who had snapped under the weight of a failing marriage. In 1996, he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. After decades on death row, Edward Zakrzewski's execution date was finally set. On August 22, 2025, he was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. For his last meal, he requested barbecue ribs and ice cream, a chillingly ordinary choice given the horrific nature of his crimes. In his final words, Zakrzewski addressed his surviving family members. He apologized for the pain he had caused and said he would carry the weight of his crimes forever. Witnesses described his tone as remorseful, but the enormity of his actions left little room for forgiveness. For many, his execution marked the end of a decades-long nightmare. But for those who knew Sylvia, Edward, and Anna, no execution could erase the horror of what happened inside that home in 1994. Florida executed more prisoners in 2025 than in any year since capital punishment was reinstated. Each case carries a story of violence, tragedy, and finality. From remorseful last words to eerie silence, these executions remind us of the devastating ripple effects of crime for victims, families, and even those facing the ultimate penalty. If you found these stories haunting, don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime content. Like this video if you believe justice was served, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more true crime investigations that will leave you questioning everything.